The first thing you have to understand with regards to trying to come to terms with the conception of the shadow is to understand the idea of persona. And persona is the you that you present when you want people to accept and like you, often like. Let's say that you go to a party and you're trying to impress the people that are there and you're trying to get them to like you. And so you maybe get jabbed at a little bit and you laugh and you go along with everyone so that they like you. And then you go home and you're bitterly resentful about the way that you were put down at this party. And that's going to make all sorts of aggressive, I wish I could have said, it's going to make all sorts of aggressive and vengeful thoughts sort of flash through your imagination. Well, the first part of the problem is that you were too much persona, right? You sacrificed yourself in some sense at the party so that people would like you. And in the second part, you're refusing to admit to the existence of those elements of you that would have actually protected you from doing that. So let's say you go home and you're all bitter and resentful and you have fantasies of revenge. I mean, that reveals to you the shadow part of you that's aggressive. And the thing is, you actually need that, because if you would have integrated that more successfully into your personality, when you went to the party, you wouldn't have had to let people put you down to get them to like you. Instead of having a face like this, which says, I'll take anything that's coming my way, you have a face and a stance that's more determined and assertive. And if you manifest that properly, people aren't going to mess with you to begin with. But, you may have already adopted a morality that says, well, I have to be likable and I shouldn't do anything that causes any conflict and I shouldn't ever, hurt anybody's feelings. And so you're just to present yourself as a punching bag and you think that that makes you a good person, but it doesn't. And there's no integration of the shadow in that situation. So you see that at the end of the movie, when I mentioned this, when Simba climbs up the rock to take control of it, all the female lionesses bare their teeth and he roars. It's like that aggressiveness is integrated into him. And so resentment is a really good emotion for making contact with the shadow side, because if you're resentful about something, it basically reveals two things. It either means that you're immature and you should stop whining and get on with things. Someone's asked, this often happens with adolescents who are asked, say, by their mother to clean up the room. You're all resentful about it. It's like, shut up and clean up your room. It's not that much to ask. Or, so that can be a gateway into the observation of your own immaturity. Or it's possible that you're resentful because people really have been poking at you too much and taking cheap shots at you and oppressing you. But what that means is that you've got some things to say that you haven't been willing to say or don't know how to say, right? You can't stand up for yourself properly. And in order to do that, you have to grow some teeth and be willing to use them. And again, that's something that might violate your morality, because you might say, well, I shouldn't be able to bite people. And the thing is, yes, you should be able to bite people hard. And if you're able to bite them, then generally you don't have to. But they need to know that you can, because otherwise, especially people who are badly socialized, they'll just keep encroaching on you and encroaching on you and encroaching on you and encroaching on you until you put up a wall. Like someone who's really well put together won't do that, because they're sophisticated. But if you run into people who only have boundaries because other people impose them on them and you won't do it, you're going to be the bullied one in the office, for example. You're not going to get a raise. People aren't going to credit you with your own work. Other people are going to take credit for it, and you're going to go home angry because you're doing your best and you're trying to get along with everyone and nothing ever goes your way. Well, it's because you're a pushover and you think that's good because you confuse harmlessness with morality. It's not right. Just because you can't do any damage doesn't mean you're moral. It just means you don't have the capability for mayhem, and that makes you a pushover. I mean, first of all, I do not believe that compassion is an untrammeled moral virtue. And I think one of the terrible things about our society, one of the deadly Oedipal things about our society, is that we've put compassion in the highest place unthinkingly. And compassion is for infants. And I really mean that technically. So like if imagine that your ethic was that you were 100% compassionate. Okay, so what are you like? Well, you're like a good mother with a child under 6 months of age, because human babies are born premature in some fundamental sense. So, the average gestation period for a mammal of about our size should be 2 years. And so our babies are born radically premature. And there's complex reasons for that. One is that there's an arms race, an evolutionary arms race between the circumference of the infant's head and the dimensions of the pelvic hole through which the baby has to pass to be born. And if the pelvis of women was any wider, they couldn't run. And if it was any narrower, then the child would die, like many children did, right? I mean, the human birth mortality rate was abysmal right up till about, well, certainly 100 years ago.
And then babies' heads are compressible, right? The bones aren't fully formed when they're born. And often kids are born and their heads are cone-shaped because they've been subject to such pressure during birth. And so it's a narrow needle to thread. And there's been a lot of evolutionary tinkering to get that right. So, our infants are born unbelievably helpless, and they are basically prenatal until they can crawl. And that's 7 or 8 months. And so prior to that, because they're so utterly helpless, everything they do has to be regarded as above moral reproach and 100% right. And so if you have an infant who is crying, who's 6 months old or 4 months old, your job is not to judge the infant or to punish the infant or to discipline the infant. It's like the infant has a problem, and all of your attention is to be focused on solving that problem. Period. 100%, that's it. And that's great for people who are under 6 months. But it's deadly, it's increasingly deadly as the child matures, because that kind of all-encompassing, I will do everything for you, is also the enemy of development. And that's the whole Freudian nightmare. I mean, that's what Freud put his finger on, and he knew that that was the pathology of the age, the Oedipal mother. And it's like, yeah, well, welcome to the age of the Oedipal mother, everyone, because that's certainly what we see now. And so if you put compassion in the highest place, well, then that's what you have, is you have a state of being where everything is an infant. And the only hallmark of ethic is pity. Now, Jung talked about classic conceptions of what is in the highest place, God. He said, well, God rules with two hands, mercy and justice. And that's that discrimination. You know how bad discrimination is. It's like, well, no, it's not. It's differentiation. It's judgment. It's putting things in their proper place. It's setting the highest above the lowest. It's formulating a pathway for further development. And, a mother might say, you're just fine the way you are. But what's that to say to someone who's, 10? Like, you're not fine the way you are. You're 10. You got a lot of growing up to do, and you're probably not fine the way you are when you're 20. It's like, you're just a fraction of what you could be. And if it's all maternal compassion, and I mean that in the symbolic sense, it's all maternal compassion, it's, well, where's the impetus for development? And there's no judgment there. And I think the most dismal thing you can tell 18-year-old boys in particular, especially if they're miserable, is, well, you're just okay the way you are. And they're not, first of all, and no one thinks they are, including them. Well, they don't. No one gives a damn about malfunctioning 18-year-old boys. Like, but you can say, with the proper admixture of justice and mercy, it's like, yeah, well, you're not so bad for 18, and you could be way more, and good for you. And then you can encourage that. And that's the spirit of justice. And that's a patriarchal spirit, fundamentally. It's the encouragement and the calling forth of further development. There has to be allowance for imperfection and error. Well, also orientation towards the aim. Yeah, and getting that balance right. Well, that's part of what consciousness does, I would say, is it constantly adjudicates between those two higher order principles. Now, those aren't the only principles, and there's no final solution to that, right? You can't just say, well, we're all compassionate and we're done with it. It's like, no. And it's an ongoing problem, right? With your kids, you're always wondering, they make a mistake. It's, well, how much do you forgive them? And how much do you say, how about you don't do that again? It's really embarrassing. It's terrible for you. If you replicate that error, your life is going to be a bloody catastrophe. You're old enough to figure it out. It's like, clue in. And you might say, well, who loves the child more? The one who says, oh, it's okay, everything you do is lovely, which it isn't. Or the person who says, you could do better. And, the answer is, well, it's a discussion between those two viewpoints constantly, because, and in your relationship with yourself, it's like, how much do you forgive yourself? And the answer certainly is 0. It's not 0. That's, no one can live without being able to forgive themselves to some degree. But by the same token, you don't want to let yourself off the hook for every idiot error you make.